We're ready? Okay. Good morning. Welcome to our final class in this series on beliefs, where we are surveying Judaism's most fundamental beliefs. And they're based on Maimonides' formulation of the 13 principles of faith. That doesn't mean there's only 13, but Maimonides considered these 13 to be the most pivotal and fundamental. And today we're going to be discussing the belief in prophecy. So here is Maimonides' description of this principle. Where does Maimonides write this? He writes it in his introduction to one of the chapters of the Mishnah. The Mishnah, which is the compilation of Jewish law after the Bible, the first written text of laws. And in one of the volumes of the Mishnah, it talks about the courts. The tractate is called Sanhedrin, which deals with the constitution of the Jewish judiciary. Now, the last chapter of that tractate talks about, the tractate talks a lot about criminals and about their punishment. And the last chapter deals with the afterlife, with the next world, the resurrection of the dead. And Maimonides wrote a commentary on the entire Mishnah. It's a major work of Maimonides. He wrote when he was in his 20s. And it's one of the most classic works of Jewish commentary. That's not his major work, but it's a very important one. And then in his work, he wrote little books where he felt he wanted to discuss matters in greater depth and greater detail. And one of those chapters, the one I just mentioned, he prefaces with a small tractate, a small treatise, where he talks about Judaism's 13 principles of faith. And here he talks about the sixth principle. And what is it called? Prophecy. And this is what he writes. Man should know. I just want to come, whenever translators use the word man, except where it specifically relates to male as opposed to female, it doesn't mean man, it means person. The Adam is the Hebrew word. Adam in Hebrew is Adam, but it also means person. So man over here means a person should know that there are men, again the word men here, there are people of great ability and perfection. We're led to believe that human beings are defined by how many mistakes they make. People go to such extremes in trying to define down what humanity is. So we have very low expectations of humanity because of that. And I hear this from across the spectrum, from the most secular to the most religious. People always saying, well, we're only human and we make mistakes, and Moses even made mistakes. Why don't we try to focus on how human beings could be so incredibly good and positive? And there are people who are not always making mistakes and always blowing it. And that's what makes up their humanity. So here's where we're going to be introduced to that concept over here, that there are people of great ability and perfection. And we're not talking about ability over here. They can run a mile quicker than anyone else. We're talking about spiritual perfection and abilities, whose souls are primed to receive pure intellectual form. Their human intellect cleaves to this active intellect and receives a profound emanation. These people are prophets, and this is called prophecy. To explain this principle with clarity would be lengthy, and our intention is neither to adduce proofs for each principle nor to present a complete elaboration of each, for this would encompass the principles. In other words, this would be a very extensive treatment. Numerous verses in the Torah attest to the prophecy of our many prophets. We don't really have to prove that Judaism believes in prophets, because 1/3 of the entire Bible is called Nevi'im, prophets. And there are hundreds, if not thousands, of references to prophets. What is the simple definition of a prophet? A simple definition of a prophet most people would say is someone who could predict the future accurately. Someone who tells you that it's going to be 80 degrees tomorrow. And if it happens, then you'd say that was a prophecy that came true. But there's much more to being a prophet than just predicting the future. And here's what we're going to discuss. Number one, how does one become a prophet? And the criteria. How do you know if someone is a prophet? Someone says, I'm a prophet, and they make predictions. Do you accept them as prophet? Or are you skeptical? Or do you just laugh at them? Most people would probably laugh at someone who'd come along. Someone would walk in right now and says, oh, you're talking about prophecy? I'm a prophet. And we're all going to roll our eyes and smirk because we can't accept that there are prophets, literally prophets. And the answer is yes, there are prophets. But how do you determine that someone is a prophet? And how do you determine that the person is not a false prophet? Because there were false prophets in the past history. In the biblical history, there were false prophets. For example, at the time of the destruction of the first temple by the Babylonians, Jeremiah was saying prophecy that there's going to be a destruction and the Jews will be driven out of the land because the Babylonians had already captured the vessels of the temple and many of the elite of the Jewish people and were driven into exile. And there was another guy whose name was Hananiah ben Azur who prophesied, no, things are going to get better. He disagreed with Jeremiah. He says things will get better and they're going to return everything and people are going to return. And of course he was wrong. He was a false prophet. And there were other false prophets throughout history. Now, a false prophet doesn't necessarily mean this person is just a charlatan who just came out of nowhere and just makes prophecies, because no one would ever be recognized as a prophet without certain criteria met. So we're going to discuss now, how does one become a prophet, and how do we know that this is really a genuine prophet? And what difference does it make if it's a genuine prophet? Let me clarify that first. Let's say we know someone is a prophet. Someone just walked in and claims to be a prophet. So how does that affect my life? Very nice. Nice to meet you, prophet. You know, it's a very nice thing to have prophets, but what difference does it make to my life? And the answer is, if the prophet who's determined to be a real prophet tells you to do something, you're obligated to do it. If the prophet says all of us should just leave the building and go protest something, we're all obligated to go. And if we don't go, it's a very serious breach of the Torah's laws. So that's why we have to be very careful who the prophet is. If someone is a charlatan and we follow this charlatan, we're doing damage to ourselves, because if he's not a real prophet, then we're committing a sin by following him. Or her, by the way. Prophecy is not restricted to men. There are women in the Bible who are also prophets or prophetesses. I don't know if there's a plural, a feminine version of it. So you don't have to be a man to be a prophet. Women could also be prophets. In fact, our sages tell us that the matriarchs, Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah, were greater in prophecy than the patriarchs, than Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So not only could women be prophets, they can even be superior to the male prophets. But anyhow, we have to be sure that the prophet is a real prophet, because it's going to make a difference in our very lives. What happens if the prophet tells us to go out and wage war? That's a little bit more serious than just going to protest. Then if he's a real prophet, we'd have to follow him. Does that mean we have to follow anything the prophet tells us? And the answer is no. There are exceptions, which we'll get into a little bit later. There are certain things that if a prophet tells us, we're not supposed to listen. We'll get into that in a moment. So here we're quoting now from Maimonides' Mishnah Torah, not his commentary to the Mishnah, but his encyclopedic work of Jewish law, his magnum opus called the Mishnah Torah, which contains a detailed presentation of all of Jewish law, leaving out nothing. It's the only such work that was ever written, a code of law that was as comprehensive as you can be. Other works will treat certain aspects of law and leave out others, and others will write about those areas. But to have a comprehensive, covering every subject of Judaism, Maimonides was the first one to do it, and he is the only one. There are other commentaries who comment on Maimonides' works, but to formulate the laws as Maimonides did, he was unique. So let's go through what he says over here in his Mishnah Torah. It is one of the foundations of our faith that God conveys prophecy to man, to humanity. I would translate it better. Prophecy is bestowed only upon a very wise sage of a strong character, who is never overcome by his natural inclinations in any regard. That means any desire that the prophet has that is not consistent with God's will, he has total, or she has total control over that, and will not succumb to that temptation or to that behavior.
So, Rabbi,
yes.
What I'm understanding what you're saying then, that if you have the thought or the inclination or the feeling or desire, that doesn't rule you out. What rules you out is if you act on it.
Yes, that's true. That's what he says. In other words, he's never overcome by his natural inclinations. Instead, with his mind, he overcomes his natural inclinations at all times. He must also possess a very broad and accurate mental capacity. You can't be a prophet if you're limited intellectually, because part of being a prophet, as we'll soon learn, is absorbing spiritual knowledge. And for that, you have to be a very great intellectual. Now, it doesn't mean that simple people can't be holy people. There are many stories of simple people who were extremely holy and superior to the smartest people. But those are not people who are considered to be prophets. They're holy people, and I'm not going to go into stories of simple people who were incredibly holy. A person who is full of all these qualities and is physically sound. It's an interesting requirement that the person has to be physically sound, because the body is also part of the person's existence and is receptive to the soul. When the body and the soul work in sync, that makes the person a perfect individual. So when he has and is physically sound, when he enters the Pardes and is drawn into these great and sublime concepts, what does that mean? He's enters the Pardes. Pardes is a Talmudic term. It means literally orchard, but it refers to the study of the mystical teachings of Torah. The Talmud tells a story of 4 great rabbis who entered the Pardes, the orchard. One of them died. One of them became mentally incapacitated. One of them became a heretic, a rebel, rebelled against God and against Judaism and the Jewish people. And one of them, Rabbi Akiva, was the only one who entered in peace and left in peace. So what exactly is this kind of orchard was this? The orchard is a metaphor. It was it was going into the deepest mystical teachings of Torah. This was a meditational experience. And it was so powerful that if they didn't enter properly, they didn't have the right approach to it, they were affected adversely. But we're not going to go into that right now. So it's someone who goes into Pardes, someone who delves into the deepest mysteries and secrets of Torah, the deepest spiritual knowledge. That's who a prophet must be. Someone who has entered into the Pardes, into this orchard, and is drawn into these great and sublime concepts. If he possesses an accurate mental capacity to comprehend and grasp them, he will become holy. He will advance and separate himself from the masses who proceed in the darkness of the time. In other words, he's not going to go share the very lowly aspects of life socializing with people who are into materialistic pursuits. He's going to separate. Doesn't mean he has to become a hermit, but he's going to associate himself with like-minded spiritual people. He must continue and diligently train himself not to have any thoughts whatsoever about fruitless things or the vanities and intrigues of the times. He's not going to watch television. Maimonides doesn't say that exactly, but I think that's what he would say if he was around today. Or politics, right? Instead, his mind should constantly be directed upward, bound beneath God's throne of glory, striving to comprehend the holy and pure forms, and gazing at the wisdom of the Holy One, blessed be He, in its entirety, in its manifold manifestations, from the most elevated spiritual form until the navel of the earth. In other words, he knows all the mysteries, the spiritual mysteries, and Maimonides was of the opinion that part of the mysteries referred to the mysteries of science, that he delves into the knowledge of the universe, appreciating God's greatness from them. After these preparations, the spirit of prophecy will immediately rest upon him. Now, it doesn't mean that every person who does this will become a prophet. Maimonides says contrarily later. But what it means is this is what is required to be a prophet. You don't have to do anything else in order. You don't have to sign any forms. You don't have to get, show your ID. You don't have to do any of those things. These are the spiritual preparations. Now, when the Spirit rests upon him, his soul becomes intermingled with the angels called Ishim. Maimonides, in another place, explains that there are 10 levels of angels. Angels are spiritual animals that are graded by their level of comprehension of the divine. The lowest level of angel are called Ishim. Ishim means people. That means they're the closest to humanity. They're the closest to human beings in terms of their perceptions. And the prophet, his perception is connected to that of these angels, and he will be transformed into a different person and will understand with a knowledge different from what it was previously. He will rise above the level of other wise men, as the prophet Samuel told King Saul, quote, "The Spirit of God will descend upon you, and you shall prophesy with them, and you will be transformed into a different person." So a prophet, he looks the same. He has 2 eyes, a nose, and a mouth. You can't tell that this person is a prophet just by looking at them, although a very holy person will certain times radiate a certain aura that anyone could notice, but that's not what determines whether he or she is a prophet. It's the spiritual level that determines that person's prophecy. Now, Maimonides goes on and this is how he describes the actual prophetic experience. There are a number of levels among the prophets. Just as with regard to wisdom, one sage is greater than his colleague. Not all scholars are equal. So too with regard to prophecy, one prophet is greater than another. They all receive prophetic visions only in a visionary dream or during the day after slumber has overtaken them. And he quotes the book of Numbers, "I make myself known to him in a vision. I speak to him in a dream." This is what God describes how he relates to prophets. That all prophets, with one exception, which we'll get into later, Moses is the exception, would get their prophecy in a vision, in a dream, when they were in a state of sleep or in a trance-like state. When any of them prophesy, their limbs tremble, their physical powers become weak, they lose control of their senses, and thus their minds are free to comprehend what they see. And he quotes Genesis about Abraham, a great dark dread fell over him. Daniel states, "My appearance was horribly changed, and I retained no strength. In other words, it's like you almost like collapse physically to allow the spiritual aspect of your being to dominate. Your physicality has to go and take a back seat.
Rabbi, but it doesn't sound then like they're asleep. Maybe in a state of...
They could be in a sleep and in a dream, or in a trance-like state where they're if you talk to them, they won't know what you're saying. They're in a different state of mind. They're not. You can't just talk to him like you're talking to me, or I'm talking to you. They couldn't receive prophecy if that would be the case, if they were totally awake and alert. Now, when a prophet is informed of a message in a vision, it is granted to him in metaphoric imagery. Immediately, the interpretation of the imagery is imprinted upon his heart, and he knows its meaning. For example, the ladder with the angels ascending and descending in Jacob's dream was an allegory for the empires and their subjugation of his descendants. The going up and down refers to the different empires. So he sees a ladder, but he understood what the ladder meant. God gives him the understanding what the image is about. Similarly, the creatures the prophet Ezekiel saw, the boiling pot and the rod from an almond tree envisioned by Jeremiah, the scroll Ezekiel saw, and the measure seen by Zechariah, they were all metaphoric images, and they understood what the metaphor was about. Similarly, some of the prophets would relate the allegory and in its explanations. Others would relate only the explanation. At times they would relate only the imagery without explaining it. So all these prophecies would come in form of metaphoric imagery and allegories. Now these prophets do not prophesy whenever they desire. Instead, they must concentrate their attention and seclude themselves in a happy, joyous mood, because prophecy cannot rest upon a person when he is sad or languid, but only when he is happy. Yes?
So when Joseph interpreted the dreams of Pharaoh, he was not being a prophet because it didn't come to him directly?
That's true. You can't call that prophecy, but he did have prophecy to know its interpretation.
Okay.
That was a prophetic vision also. Therefore, he says the prophet's disciples, just like we have schools where you have students who are trained to become rabbis, in those days there were schools with people who were training to become prophets. Not all of them graduated to become prophets, but they tried. So therefore, the prophet's disciples will always have a harp, drum, flute, and lyre when they were seeking prophecy. Why? Because you have to be in a state of joy. When you're in a state of depression, your soul is like squeezed. It doesn't have the openness to absorb the spiritual knowledge and inspiration. So how do you create a state of happiness, of joy? Through music. So music was always used by the prophets. This is what is meant by the expression in the book of Samuel. They were prophesying, that is, they were following the path of prophecy until they would actually prophesy. And those who aspire to prophecy are called the disciples of the prophets. Even though they concentrate their attention, it is possible that the divine presence will rest upon them, and it's possible that it will not rest upon them. Now, all of the statements we just discussed, Maimonides writes, applies to all prophets, early and later prophets, with the exception of Moses, our teacher, the master of all prophets, which we'll go into a little bit later. Okay, so now, what are the restrictions of prophecy? Well, one restriction is that the prophet has to be in a state of joy. But that's not a restriction of the prophecy, it's a restriction of the ability to be a prophet. But what is the one restriction that you know that the prophet is not a valid prophet? What do you think it is?
When he asks you to seek out other gods.
That's, generally speaking, that's right. If the prophet tells you, now we're talking about someone who had established himself as a prophet. He did everything right. And he also made predictions, and they all came true. And he performs miracles. Although Maimonides writes that a prophet does not have to perform miracles to establish his credentials. Yes?
Tells you something in opposition to the Torah.
Right. If the prophet comes to you and says, God told me that from now on you don't have to observe Shabbos on Saturday, it's now Tuesday. Mm-hmm. And he performs a miracle. He goes to the cemetery and he knocks on a grave, and the person comes out, the dead body comes out and is alive. I'm just using that that's a pretty big miracle. And he does any miracle you ask him to do, and they all come true. And he makes predictions, and every one of his predictions comes true. You would think this guy is for real. And he tells you to change one iota of Jewish law. To serve other gods is the most heinous deviation. But he tells you that one aspect of Judaism should be changed. You're not allowed to follow that prophet. In fact, that prophet deserves the death penalty for trying to abrogate the laws of the Torah. However, there's an exception to the exception. If the prophet comes and tells you, I got this prophecy. Now, someone we know has established his credentials. I know, I had received a prophecy that I'm supposed to tell you that this week, and this week only, no one should observe the Sabbath. It's a temporary suspension of Jewish law. You're obligated to listen to him. And where do we find a precedent for that? Elijah. He had to prove to the Jewish people who were worshiping the idol called Baal. So what did he do? He had them bring a sacrifice. Where did he do this? This was outside the temple area.
Mount Carmel.
Mount Carmel. Where's Mount Carmel? That's near Haifa. That's totally removed from the place of the temple. And there's a law that once the Beit HaMikdash, the Holy Temple, was built, you're not allowed to bring a sacrifice any place in the world, no matter where. And he told them to bring a sacrifice, and he brought a sacrifice, and God responded to him, as the story goes in the Bible. But how was he allowed to tell them to bring a sacrifice, and he himself brought a sacrifice in an unauthorized place? The answer is it was a one-time thing. It was an ad hoc. It was an exception to the rule. If he would have said, from now on, you don't have to bring a sacrifice in the temple, the law had changed, he would have been guilty of a capital crime. But because it was a one-time thing and he was an accepted prophet, we had to follow. But there's an exception to that. So it's an exception to the exception to the exception. If the prophet comes and tells you one time only, I have a prophecy, the prophet says, that God wants you or anyone or a group of people to worship an idol just one time. There's some real emergency that we have to do that. You're not allowed to listen. That's one exception to the exception, and then you're not allowed to. So in short, the prophet is determined to be a false prophet if he tells you to violate the Torah, unless it's a one-time thing with the exception of idolatry. What is the role of the prophet? So really there are two kinds of prophets. There's a prophet whose role is to speak to the people, to shore up their observances, to inspire them to become better Jews and better people, to get them to do the right thing. That's what all the biblical prophets did. Jonah, for example, was told to go to Nineveh and get the people there to change. But that was the same thing with every prophet. Isaiah does it, Jeremiah does it. That's what prophets were all about. But you could be a prophet and you don't necessarily have a message to give people. You just have this divine inspiration. Those kinds of prophets come a dime a dozen. It's the prophets that have a special mission to the Jewish people and to the world at large. Those are the biblical prophets that we know of. Does prophecy still exist? many people within the Jewish tradition believe that the era of prophecy came to an end. Who were the last prophets in the Torah and the biblical literature? 3 prophets who lived up until the beginning of the Second Temple era: Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. These are the 3 last prophets. What happened after that? That was it. The era of prophecy had ended, the Talmud says. Does that mean there are no more prophets? So the answer is no. Maimonides, when he discusses prophecy, does not give any time limits. Any other commandment that have a time limit, Maimonides will specify this does no longer applies because we don't have the Beit HaMikdash, we don't have the Holy Temple. But when it comes to prophecy, Maimonides does not qualify it. He doesn't say it doesn't apply anymore. And not only that, in one of his famous letters, a letter that he wrote to the people of Yemen, which made him very famous in Yemen, to this day, Yemenite Jews consider Maimonides to be their final authority. So he writes over there that a period will come before Mashiach, before the Messianic age, when prophecy will return to the Jewish people. And he writes, I knew someone who was a prophet. But Maimonides was not the only one. There were thousands and thousands of people throughout Jewish history who were known to be prophets. In our own generation, the Rabbi was clearly a prophet, and not only he, but there are many others as well. But there are so many. I'll just share a few stories that come to mind to show that prophecy still exists. This is a story that happened after the Rebbe suffered a debilitating stroke and couldn't speak anymore. I think he could say 2 words, yes or no, but otherwise he wasn't able to speak. So when they asked him questions, he would shake his head one way or the other. This is, I don't know which year it was, but this is when Hurricane Andrew? Was supposed to hit Miami Beach. It was a major hurricane. And the state ordered everyone to evacuate. So one of the Hasidim who lived in Miami Beach called up the Rebbe's office, and the Rebbe's secretary presented the question to the Rebbe, should this person evacuate? And the Rebbe went like this. He shook his head no. And the secretary asked the question in several different ways to make sure he's getting the right answer, because the Rebbe couldn't speak. And so he knew he's not going to evacuate. But then there were other Hasidim who lived closer to the water, and they were told that the hurricane is going to hit them head on. So they were a little skeptical. Maybe what the Rebbe told this guy doesn't apply to me. So he called up the Rebbe's office, and again, when they said, should we evacuate? The Rebbe said no. Very, very strident no. Don't evacuate. And this was in all the newspapers in Florida. Everyone was evacuated except for the Hasidim, who stayed in their homes living on the beach. Now, where did people evacuate to? I forgot which city it was. It was a city in the interior of Florida, which was not going to be getting the brunt of the hurricane. So here the Hasidim are all on the right at the target. If anyone was going to be hit, it was going to be them. And the hurricane they were predicting was coming closer and closer, a straight hit to them. What happened is the last minute, the hurricane, as it was approaching Miami Beach, turned around and hit the place where everyone evacuated to. And the place at Miami Beach sustained almost no damage. Not only no one was hurt, but almost no damage. People's homes were totally intact. And everyone else around got hit. That was one story that happened after the Rebbe suffered the stroke. But there are so many other stories where the Rebbe would tell people not to have surgery, where the doctor said the person needs surgery. I'll give you an example. There's a famous chassid who's known for his brilliance and his many writings, Rabbi Adin Steinsaltz. Some of you may have heard about him. He translated the whole Talmud into Hebrew. He wrote dozens, if not more, books, and he was a brilliant, brilliant man. And he had a son who had very lethal form of cancer. And the doctors said that they have to do surgery in order to save his life. And he asked the Rabbi, and the Rabbi says, do not do the surgery. And the doctors were very upset. They said, everyone over here has done the surgery, and you're the only one, and you're doing something terrible to your son. And they really berated him for not doing the surgery. The end was, everyone else who had the surgery died. This Adin Steinsaltz's son is still alive today and well. And there are hundreds of stories, or maybe thousands, but hundreds of stories like that. And there's an opposite story. There was a famous Hasidic artist, Heschel Lieberman was his name, who had cancer, and the doctors said, there's no point in operating. It won't help him. It'll just accelerate his death. He asked the Rebbe, and the Rebbe says, find a doctor who will do the surgery. And he found a doctor to do the surgery, and he lived, I don't know, another 15, 20 years after that. And there are stories like this by the thousands. A person who is able to predict the future, and someone who we know is on a very high spiritual level. If someone comes along and says, I'm a prophet, don't do the surgery, you're not allowed to listen to that person because he's taking someone's life and threatening it and has not established himself as a prophet. Now, why is belief in prophecy a principle of faith? Because, very briefly, if someone does not believe that God communicates with us, then there's no basis for anything that's in the Torah. Because the Torah is all based on what a prophet, namely Moses, who was a unique prophet, as we'll soon see, what he communicated to us. If you believe that God does not communicate with humanity, which is what secular influences have, tried to indoctrinate people with that false belief, if one doesn't accept that, then it means that God can never hold us accountable for anything, because he never told us what he wants, because nothing that God doesn't communicate. We believe that God does communicate with us. In fact, God communicates with every one of us, not necessarily as prophets, although the Talmud says that when the temple was destroyed and the era of prophecy came to an end, the era of prophecy, it was given to children and fools. So if someone comes along and it's not a holy person and makes good predictions, that person is probably a fool. Why a fool? Because a fool and a child don't have the thick layer that covers up their ability to be receptive to spiritual vibes, to spiritual energy. But anyhow, let's go on. Among prophets, Moses was unique. In what way was he unique? Moses was unique. And that's on page 4, text 4. What is the difference between Moses' prophecy and that of all the other prophets? All the other prophets got their inspiration in a dream or vision. Moses, our teacher, would prophesy while standing awake. And quotes the book of Numbers. Moses came into the tent of meeting to speak to him, to God. He heard the voice speaking to him. Now, divine insight is bestowed upon all the other prophets through the medium of an angel. Therefore, they perceive only metaphoric imagery and allegories. Moses, our teacher, didn't need the medium of an angel. As it says, mouth to mouth I speak to him, and God spoke to Moses face to face. He gazes upon the image of God. There was no metaphor. Rather, he would perceive the matter in its fullness without metaphor or allegory. Now, just to summarize the differences between Moses and other prophets on page 6. Moses had no intermediary. He didn't need an angel to connect him to this divine inspiration. Number 2, Moses received prophecy while fully awake. Moses' faculties were intact. He didn't fall into a trance. He didn't lose his composure. And Moses was capable of accessing prophecy at will. In other words, he didn't have to wait when God was ready to speak to him, at any time, day or night, he could just call upon God and receive the prophecy. Yes?
What do you mean, Rabbi, when it says God spoke to Moses face to face? Obviously, God has no...
Right, it means directly. There was no intermediary. It's like when I speak to you face to face, I'm speaking directly to you. If I didn't want to speak directly to you, I would call you on the phone. That's indirect. But here it was a totally direct communication.
So he just heard a voice while awake. But
Right.
He didn't see a physical...
No, of course not. Of course not. Any physical properties ascribed to God in the Bible, in the Torah, is a use of figure of speech, as Maimonides explains over and over again. So Moses' prophecy was unique, and that's why Moses was the chosen one to deliver the teachings of the Torah, because his communication cannot be abrogated by any prophet. That's the reason why if a prophet tells you to do something that's against the Torah, we don't listen to it. Why not? He's a prophet. But because Moses overrode him, anything that was communicated in the Torah through Moses takes precedence and overrides anything that came through any other prophet, no matter how great that prophet would be. Now, someone asked me a question, I don't want to forget about it. Who is a greater prophet, Moses? Who was greater, Moses or Mashiach? If Mashiach is going to be the final redeemer, is he greater than Moses? And the answer is yes. Yes, yes. Moses is greater and Mashiach is greater. According to Maimonides and others, Mashiach is not as great as Moses in prophecy. Moses will always remain the greatest prophet. But in terms of leadership, in terms of wisdom, in terms of spiritual stature, Mashiach will be greater than Moses. The only thing that Moses will be the greatest is prophecy and perhaps humility. The Torah says he's the most humble person on the face of the earth. So no one could match Moses' humility and prophecy. But other respects, it says that Mashiach will teach Torah to everyone, including Moses. That there will be dimensions of the Torah that even Moses didn't grasp that will be taught by Mashiach. So they're both right. In some respects, Mashiach is greater. In some respects, Moses is greater. Okay, we didn't finish all the principles of faith. Maimonides has 13. So we're probably going to continue the series, God willing, after Passover. And did finish the others. Plus other principles of faith that are not included in Maimonides' formulation. Anyone has any questions? I want to make a prediction that in 2 weeks there will be the holiday of Passover.
You're a prophet.
And within another 8 to 12 weeks there will be warm weather. Yes.
Is the center doing a Passover dinner or anything?
Nothing was scheduled. It's a little... Okay. Again, discriminating against men. Jewish Women's Circle invites you to Sips and Salads, pre-Passover ladies' night out. Sample fine Passover wines and gourmet spring salads. Bring home Seder salads recipes. Gift of shmura matzah for each guest. Wednesday, March 29th at 7:30 at the home of Sonia Young on 316 Forest View Drive. So that's for the women only. And also, we're going to be giving everyone some shmura matzah. And we have forms, and there are forms for the sale of chametz that you leave here after filling it out.